Hi, everyone. Happy holidays, and welcome back to Father-Offspring Interviews, episode 44.
And as this is being posted on New Year's Day, happy 2025. May it be a much better year for Earth than 2024.
Well, our first question of 2025 is from Mari from Spain, who says, I would like to know if there's any biological reason why humans want to appear younger than we are, and if it occurs in the animal world.
Well, that is a great question. Before addressing it, as an aside, we strive for the greatest journalistic standards here of integrity and accuracy. So just wanted to clarify something. Last week, when I was mocking the now deposed dictator of Syria, Bashar al-Assad, I referred to him pejoratively as a nerdy deeb. I meant to say a nerdy dweeb. So my apologies to everyone. Now, on to the question. Not everyone wants to appear younger. This is not a uniform phenomenon because at various points, people want to appear older. Kids, for example, adolescents, and that's your world of like adolescent boys trying to pencil in their peach fuzz mustache or adolescent girls dressing precociously, provocatively, perhaps looking like strumpets, which you never did, I should add. But doing that, and in those cases, some of that is like an instrumental goal to be able to like not get carded and get a drink. Some of it is broader, though. By looking older when you were an adolescent, you seem more authoritative, more sort of cohesive as an individual, more sexualized, whatever. But it should also be noted that does not go on forever. At some point, you don't have 45-year-olds trying to look old enough to get early bird specials at IHOP or rip off Social Security for benefits or whatever. So what we see is there is an early point in life where people often want to appear older, a point later where they want to appear younger, and thus a transition somewhere in there, which I have come up with a neologism, which I will call chronostasis, chronostatic equilibrium, the point where someone does not want to look either older or younger than themselves. And that produces a magical moment where you look in a mirror. This is typically, I would guess, on a Friday night, you're about to go to a party. And for about 2 seconds or so, you are actually satisfied with how you look and how old you look, unless you have a moment of chronostatic nirvana, and that soon passes. But once that point is passed, yeah, there is this general theme of people wanting to look younger, depending on which culture they are in. And in our own culture, this desire for chronostatic nirvana has driven all sorts of capitalism. For example, Forever 21. Are they selling Forever 21 clothes to 12-year-olds or 73-year-olds more commonly?
I'd say the target audience is mostly 12-year-old tween girls who are ready for their time in the sun.
Okay, so that chronostasis in that case is desiring people to look forever 21, targeting people who are younger. And that comes through in all sorts of settings, the science fiction movie where the protagonist is talking to some couple and the guy in the couple is some studly quarterback type and the woman is this hot cheerleader, and of course they turn out to be the protagonist's great grandparents thanks to whatever anti-aging whatever. Yes, so adulthood often consists of a drive to look younger if you're in the right culture, if you're in a specific, typically westernized one. In much of the more developing world with more indigenous populations, there's not a particular drive to look younger. And in fact, you want to be older because you get to be an elder, you get to boss everyone around. And that is, in fact, quite desirable. And, would come back to Kenya, to my field side after a year away, and people would be very complimentary, saying, oh, look at you. You look so old. You look so fat. Oh, you survived a year. You haven't starved to death. That was highly, highly complimentary. And lots of these cultures have all sorts of honorific phrases built around sort of your subordination to elders. Out in my parts, it was the Swahili phrase. With an old person, you would say, Shikamu mzee, I grasp your feet, old man. And in lots of cultures, that is in fact a sign of sort of respect for elderly people. And the response is, come close to me, my child. And you put your hand on their forehead, things like that. I always confused people in East Africa simply because when I first went there, even at 20, I already had a fairly full beard, which you do not get until you get old men there. So everyone I realized was vaguely unconsciously viewing me as some sort of elderly man, except that I wore shorts, which you only see in school children. So there was this incongruity of my looking like this elderly school child. And all I could conclude is that most people thought I had progeria or something. So, anyway, nonetheless, in westernized culture, there is this drive in adulthood to want to look younger. And what is that about? I think younger is actually a surrogate term there for what people are actually looking for is signals of fertility. Fertility, when looking at the evolution of this, because as we'll see shortly, it's not just humans who are trying to look younger as a surrogate marker of looking more fertile. I think that's what it's actually mostly about. And what you see is all sorts of symbols of attractivity are built around sort of endocrine correlates of fertility, secondary sexual characteristics. Women, for example, when they are ovulating, much as in other primate species, when human women are ovulating with high estrogen levels, their faces get a little bit rounder because of water retention by the estrogen in faces, and that's a secondary sexual characteristic. And men find that when you manipulate with photoshopped or whatever faces of women, as you make them a little bit rounder as they appear right mid-cycle, they are perceived as being more attractive because that's a marker of higher estrogen levels, more fertility. And this harks to a classic study by the psychologist David Buss, University of Texas. He looked at people from cultures all over the planet, giving them a list of attributes of what are the most important ones, rank them of what you look for in a life partner. And something that came through was in essentially every culture on earth, men were more interested in finding a partner younger than women were. How is that interpreted? Younger, more fertility. And it's not by chance that when you get some guy who has saved up enough cows to go buy himself a third wife, it's going to be some nubile 13-year-old rather than an 80-year-old crone sort of thing. What he also observed, the flip side is every culture he looked at, women on the average were more concerned with the economic prowess of their potential male mate than were men in the equivalent cultures. And that, in effect, translates out to the same thing. These are two different approaches to passing on copies of your genes. One is by being physiologically fertile. The other is in a world in which accumulation of material wealth makes a big difference as to whose kids are going to survive and things of that sort. Being a corpulently wealthy guy is definitely a marker of secondary sexual attraction in the sense of the economist Thorsten Veblen of conspicuous consumption. The literalness of consuming lots of calories by a wealthy, powerful man in lots of traditional human cultures is sure a clear marker of this is someone you would just as well take care of your kids because they're more likely to survive. Speaking of that, breaking sort of our fourth wall here a bit, I very much hope somebody is going to send us the question of just how big was Winston Churchill's ass? Because there's a very interesting answer to that. Anyway, so fertility, and that's not just the case in humans. You look for indices of fertility and markers of elevated testosterone levels in males, jutting jaws, high foreheads, lots of muscle mass, not infinitely younger. Among baboons, for example, when females start cycling, when they are just hitting puberty, typically there's about a 6-month lag between when a female is starting to have estrous cycles and menstruating. And when she is in fact actually fertile, there's a lag time when the bits and pieces are just getting going. And typically she is not of interest to adult males during that period. Proximal mechanism, she probably doesn't smell interesting enough. It's only about 6 months into cycling that suddenly kicks in. So that as a marker of fertility. I think the other reason why people want to look younger is also a surrogate marker for looking healthy. And that's another universal across all sorts of species. You look for someone to mate with who signals fertility, likelihood of passing on copies of genes, or likelihood that the genes you've passed on will survive, and markers of health. And this gives rise to one of the consistent, reliable markers of attractiveness in every human culture looked at, and in birds and fish and primates and all of that, which is looking for facial symmetry. Facial symmetry, that turns out to be a pretty good marker of conventional, averaged, healthy appearance. And all these cool studies where you average a whole bunch of faces together, and the composite face everybody rates as being more attractive than any of the individual faces. What's that about? Because typically being marred by some hideous, grotesque illness doesn't occur symmetrically. You lose teeth only on one side, or you got horrible suppurating sores or only one side of the face or so. So that facial symmetry is another marker of it. And in general, that is a correlate of being younger and healthier. Now, all of this was emphasized by the zoologist Sahavi with what he called his handicap principle, which is if looking young, if looking fertile, if looking healthy is what is selling this season, every single season, what you want to do is pour your resources into looking younger, healthier, more fertile, all of that handicap principle. And what this is about is you look at some secondary sexual characteristics in species, and you have organisms spending ridiculous amounts of their caloric wealth on some secondary display, some ridiculous, huge, hideous neon antlers, or who knows what. And what are you communicating to a potential mate? If I can afford to waste so many calories on this plumage and these feathers and this extra useless muscle mass or whatever, I'm your guy, mate with me, a conspicuous display of health and fertility and youth. And of course, what that opens the way for is honesty in advertising. Are individuals actually honestly advertising markers of fertility, youth, and healthfulness? And that's where you see all sorts of room for manipulation and cheating. Organisms during periods of drought, where they're on their last legs, will be using a weird, disproportionate percentage of their remaining calories on maintaining their glossy secondary sexual characteristics. This is the world of plastic surgeons. This is the world of the alleged reproductive electoral strategy of Ron DeSantis of wearing lifts in his shoes so he would appear taller. So truth in advertising comes into this. This has a grotesque historical footnote, something that was shown in the movie Schindler's List, that in many concentration camps, at various points, the Nazis would get inmates out and have them naked, run a lap around the camp, and see who still seemed in good shape. And they got to survive another day of slave labor, and everyone else went off to be gassed. And what was the truth in advertising trying to appear healthier strategy that people would take just before these runs? They would stab their fingers, poke themselves in to get some blood to rub it on their cheeks, to appear more rosy cheeked, healthier, younger, more suitable to be kept alive another day. So I think the attraction of youngness, when it is occurring, it's not universal, it's not in all points of life, but when it is there, it is mostly a surrogate for looking fertile and looking healthy. And that is way beyond just humans as something that organisms find to be appealing.
Okay, so next, and sort of along similar lines, Giordano from Italy says, Does beauty make us believe that something is also good? And if so, is the reverse also true? For example, if something is good, does our brain make us perceive it as more beautiful than it actually is?
Good. Perfect extension on the previous question, having to do with the fact that, oh, we've got our fancy human brains and we come up with metaphors. We come up with metaphors of all sorts. And it turns out our brains are not very good at handling metaphors because we're dealing with a 100 million-year-old primate brain and metaphors are fairly recent. So your brain is improvising. And we see examples where you get a part of the brain that handles something very literal, and in humans, it handles something very metaphorical as well. And the result is it often gets confused as to which is which. For example, it's part of the brain, the anterior cingulate cortex, and every beastie out there, it has something to do with your perception, interpretation of painful stimuli. And what's the metaphorical thing that it does in us as well is you feel someone else's pain in the anterior cingulate. And the fact that neurons there, some of them literally cannot tell the difference between physical pain and empathic pain, tells you that the brain can't distinguish the literal from the metaphorical in that regard, which is where the power of empathy can come from. Similarly, part of the brain that we've mentioned, the insular cortex, every species out there, what it's about is detecting disgusting tastes, disgusting smells, keeping you from consuming something poisonous. And we've extended it to include disgusting behaviors, disgusting norm violations of morals, which is why when someone does something appalling, we feel sick to our stomach and makes us feel queasy. So the brain has trouble sort of distinguishing the literal from the metaphorical. And that's the case every time we understand someone else's pain and we open our hearts to them. We don't literally open our hearts. And when we understand them, we are not literally standing underneath something. So a lot of this metaphorical stuff going on, which taps into this realm that the brain has a lot of problems distinguishing between physical beauty, external beauty, visual, sensorial beauty, and metaphorical moral beauty. And it's the same deal here in that, moral beauty is a relatively new concept for a vertebrate, and it just got shoehorned into the part of the brain looking for those nice, attractive, symmetrical, young, fertile faces. And your brain often confuses physical beauty, external beauty, with good acts, moral beauty, things in that realm. And like a long tradition of people very, very explicitly viewing external beauty as a marker of internal beauty. And this comes through in all sorts of ways where, the attractiveness of someone will influence how likely they are to be hired for a job. If they are hired, what the starting salary is, how likely they are to get elected. If they are a criminal defendant, how likely are they to be convicted? Less likely if you're a good looking criminal. And for the same conviction, a shorter sentence. One interesting exception to that, which is the observation that on the average, white bread, white American juries met out shorter jail sentences for African American men who are wearing glasses. They seem less threatening. They seem more eggheady. They seem somewhat more sufficiently so that people in the business call this the nerd defense or the dweeb defense, and sufficiently so that in some courts, judges say you cannot wear glasses as a defendant unless they are prescription glasses, like if you really need them. Okay, so that's a realm where physical attractiveness and goodness takes a weird, racially loaded side spur. But in general, yeah, we have great confusion of moral goodness and physical external beauty goodness. And what that should immediately indicate is there's like one part or a few parts of the brain that handle both. And that turns out to absolutely be the case. There's this part where the occipital cortex meets the temporal and parietal cortices, where when you were looking at faces and evaluating their beauty, and you were reading about a moral act and evaluating its moral goodness, you were activating the same neurons there. Interestingly, the fact that it is related to occipital cortex, which is where visual stuff is processed, we see on some level moral goodness. We categorize it in some sort of visual sense. Another two parts of the brain, one in particular, the orbitofrontal cortex and the nearby prefrontal cortex. You put people in a brain scanner and they read a scenario and they have to contemplate, was this a morally good act that's being described in here or not? Or then they alternate and look at faces and decide, is this an attractive face or not? And what you see is, in both cases, you are using this orbital frontal cortex. Is this a beautiful act? Is this a beautiful face? And when the conclusion to either is, no, this is an appalling, asymmetrical moral act or face, you then pull in that insular cortex, that part of the brain having to do with disgust and aversive sensory experiences and things. So you're using the same parts of the brain. No wonder we get confused. And what this begins to indicate is, again, the notion of like moral goodness is not an ancient mammalian trait. It's fairly recent when it was come up with. It just kind of got shoehorned in to the parts of your brain that handle external beauty, physical attractiveness, and it gets intermixed with moral assessments. Now, an interesting aside, when you read those papers in that, you're testing subjects and here, look at this face and now look at this face. Like you got to have faces of people who are considered attractive or unattractive, and that opens all sorts of touchy issues there as to who winds up being in the unattractive experimental picture cohort. And what's often done in these studies is that drawings are made of the subjects instead. In fact, a recent paper in the journal Brain Structure and Function, author was Quirping Cheng from South China Normal University, doing one of these brain imaging. Is this a good or a bad act? Is this a good or a bad face? Does this person's act seem more noble if they're a beautiful person? All of that. So they had drawings, and as you could see from two examples here, one of the, I kid you not, what were labeled as the BF examples, beautiful faces, and then the UF examples as drawn by the first author, and you know where that's heading, looking like gargoyles. So this is how a lot of those studies are done. But what we see is this classic mismatch. We're asking our ancient brains to be doing something novel and figuring out a beautiful moral act. And they're not always intertwined with beauty. We do not require Mother Teresa to have had like puffy lips and childbearing hips or something like that for us to have decided that there was moral beauty to our actions. But nonetheless, this is a frequent intertwining. Our brains have had a very short amount of time to be winging it with metaphorical stuff.
And anyone who wants to learn a little bit more about that, I would say definitely go look up the halo effect, which is a cognitive bias in psychology. All right, so our final question is from Kim from Missouri, who asks, my dad has spinocerebellar ataxia, so our whole family has been sort of having a crash course on what the cerebellum is supposed to do. What's your favorite cerebellum fact?
Well, first off, Kim, I'm very sorry to hear about your father's problems. That is yet another disease to add to everyone's list that you would want to avoid if you got a choice in the matter. A spinocerebellar ataxia, uncoordinated movement, increasingly impaired, having everything to do with the cerebellum. Part of the brain just below the occipital cortex, cited only a few minutes ago, underneath the cerebellum. It is a fascinating part of the brain with a beautiful cellular architecture to it and a vast number of neurons. And to my great embarrassment, I have to admit that as this sort of porcine Philistine, I've never actually been terribly interested in the cerebellum. Nonetheless, even I'm forced to admit that it does some interesting things. What it is about, above all, is movement, coordination of movement, fine motor control, the cerebellum being great for stuff like that. And out of it comes this fascinating finding, which is You learn something. You first learn to do something. You first learn to play something on the piano. And you have to be very conscious of it. You have to be focused. You have to be aware of what you're doing. Here's the stretch on the piano. Here comes these two measures with that difficult run. And you have to very consciously each time think beforehand, here it comes. Remember, I do this with my thumb. I keep my elbow tucked in. I lean this way. Whatever, you are making use of very explicit, declarative memory about what's going on in this piece of music. And then there's the day we were playing along and you suddenly realize you're four measures past that hard part. You just blasted through it and it went fine. This was the first day you didn't have to consciously think about it. This is the first day, metaphorically, that your hands knew it better than your head did. What's that about neurobiologically? That's the day that it's going from working memory, your frontal cortex, declarative, explicit knowledge that this is what I'm going to do with my fingers, to the first day that it's automatic, implicit, procedural memory, motor memory. And what is seen is that's the day this has been transferred from a task that your declarative prefrontal cortex is in charge of to your cerebellum is in charge of. Your cerebellum is where you have centered motor memory, automatic stuff. And essentially, if you don't have a cerebellum, you are never going to get really good at walking up and down stairs quickly without having to think about it, with doing something agile in sports without having to think about it. As soon as it goes from the declarative to the procedural, it's moving to a property back into the domain of the cerebellum. And this has a fascinating implication in Alzheimer's disease. Alzheimer's, which we've talked about a bit, and everyone knows Alzheimer's is a disease where you lose your memory. It's much more interesting than that, in that there's a whole taxonomy of different types of memory, and only some of them are damaged in Alzheimer's. Short-term memory is typically fine. Remote memories back to your childhood is typically fine. Long-term memory from the previous hour to the previous decades, that's what's damaged. In addition, in Alzheimer's, declarative memory is what is damaged, and procedural memory remains intact. So you get someone with Alzheimer's and they cannot tell you what decade it is, what continent they're on, what the names of these people are, despite it being their kids and grandkids. And despite that, this retired plumber can take apart a sink trap and clear out the clogged whatever and put it back together, and it's perfectly great, and they still have no idea what century it is. Declarative memory down the drain, the procedural stuff is still there. So that's been sort of this dichotomy in the field, and you look at an Alzheimer's brain post-mortem, and the areas that are damaged are counties away from the cerebellum. Cerebellum is spared in Alzheimer's disease, so that makes perfect sense. Declarative knowledge about you know something and you know that you know it, and you can work strategically in an executive manner in a conscious way with it, that goes down the tubes. But cerebellar dependent, implicit procedural motor memory remains intact. So what's interesting about that? What's a remarkable finding that people in the field are still trying to make sense of? Your grandfather, Grandpa Thomas, had a dementia in his later years. It was not Alzheimer's, but it was related to that. And in his later years, near the end, he could not tell you what century it was, what the names were of his kids, etc., all of that. But as an architectural historian, given the slightest priming poke there, and he could give you a 20-minute long lecture about the history of flying buttresses and Gothic architecture. And if you then waited a minute afterward and poked him with the same cue again, he would give you the same lecture again. Whoa! For someone who is a retired architectural historian, a 20-minute lecture about flying buttresses is a motor memory. In the cerebellum? What is it doing there? And I saw an astonishing additional example of this once. I was giving a talk in a neurology department somewhere, and they were sort of taking me around beforehand, showing me some of their interesting dementia patients. And we're heading to this guy's room, and the person leading me around said, "You're going to love this guy. This is so interesting. Come on in." And we go in and there's this very spry 80-year-old man where as soon as we come in the room, he leaps up and he comes over to us and he grabs my hand and he says, I am so glad to see you. I am so glad you could make it here today. I'm really appreciative of your support. Are you hungry? We've got a whole spread of food here. Here, grab some food. It is great to see you. Who was this man? Many decades before, he had been the governor of that state. He once did something wonderful in about a week and a half. People thought he should become president. He had been the governor, and now, as an octogenarian with Alzheimer's, this was something preserved. This man spent the last few years of his life believing he was at a Sunday morning lox and bagel fundraiser for the election coming up. For a politician saying, are you hungry? We've got to have some food. We've got bialys. I'm so glad. I appreciate your support. Doing that was motor memory for someone like that. So a huge challenge for the field. This fascinating factoid is the cerebellum and its related pathways of motor memory. They're not just storing motoric stuff, they're storing everything that becomes so automatic that you don't even need to think about it. And you get the right interesting sort of people with the dementia, and some of that stuff is still perfectly intact there. And that's a big puzzle in the field.
And that is episode 44. Keep submitting questions at the form found in the Instagram story highlight and bio or the YouTube video description. I'm Offspring Chair Sapolsky. Happy New Year, and thanks for your continued support of science and the beard.